Yeah, hey, thank you, Jim. It's great to be here. I am new to this team, so I was going to give you an introduction, but Jim kind of took care of that. Officially, my title at Microsoft, my official title with Microsoft is an Azure App Dev TSP. TSP is one of those million three-letter acronyms that Microsoft is famous for. That stands for Technology Solution Professional, but don't care about that. Anything you guys need to care about is that both my background and my job at Microsoft are PaaS, Platform as a Service. So things like hosted websites, serverless functions, Azure functions, all that kind of thing. As opposed to, we have another guy on our team that focuses on virtual machines, networking, backups, all that kind of stuff. DevOps, VSTS, coding, all that kind of stuff. So, I'm trying to zip through a couple slides here just to set the table and give you an idea of where what I'm going to demo here for you today is going to fit into the landscape. Real quick, the slides that I've got are about app modernization and DevOps. So the idea of app modernization is taking applications and to some extent revamping them to take advantage of the cloud. So you've heard this term lift and shift about taking things like virtual machines or VMware, all that kind of stuff, and lifting and shifting it over to the cloud. Well, as developers, a lot of us like to focus on the stuff that comes beyond that. Moving into the new territory, taking advantage of all these new things that the cloud has to offer in the form of the PaaS, the serverless, the SaaS, if you get that far into it. So why modernize? I mean, you guys can read the slides here and probably don't care too much about all those things. But the point is, we want to take advantage of the offerings of the cloud. Some characteristics of the modern application scenario. A lot of it's mobile oriented, and if not mobile oriented, at least form factors, mobility, being able to use those different applications on different machines, different form factors, connected, various stages of connectivity. Certainly, we all like to be connected all the time, but sometimes that's not the case. So in those mobile applications or whatnot, it's nice to have a scenario where you can still use that application offline. Responsive, scalability. We want to be able to scale with the cloud and make sure that when the build registration goes online and 10,000 developers are hitting it within 10 minutes, that thing can scale. Resilient, that's kind of speaks for itself. Sorry, you guys got the, let's see if I can move that out of the way a little bit. Changing, that's where we're going to come back and tie in the DevOps conversation. How can we start developing applications that iterate quickly and efficiently? I come back to that. The last one I want to talk about is intelligent. That's a big push you're going to start seeing more and more of. You probably have already been exposed to that, but that's kind of the concept of having or adding in machine learning, artificial intelligence, all those kind of things into your application so that it becomes smarter. That's kind of the newest, greatest frontier out there these days. Some of the examples I have from Azure itself, if you have a SQL Azure database that sits there and runs and takes a lot of traffic, all of a sudden Azure will start spitting out recommendations to say, hey, have you thought about adding this index? It'll really improve your performance. So that's all under the guise of machine learning and artificial intelligence that takes place. Quick modernization, right? I mean, lift and shift. So you can take a virtual machine, you can lift it up and move it over as a virtual machine. And lo and behold, you're in the cloud. But you probably haven't gained a whole lot with that. You may gain some TCO efficiencies, a little bit better price, some of those kind of things, density. But at the end of the day, it's still, in most cases, a legacy, some sort of legacy application that's being lifted and shifted. You can go one step further and you can even modernize that into a container. So how many of you guys have dealt with containers, Docker, Kubernetes? Few. So in a lot of cases, you can package those up in a container and then start taking incremental steps that way. Oops, sorry. Try and hit the right button. So I really like this slide because it kind of lays out, as it says, the application maturity model. So as you start off on premise and you kind of migrate over to the right side, you move into the IaaS, the virtual machines, the networking, the VNets, those types of things. Containers as a service, container platform in the middle. Now you're taking on some new deployment methods, some new deployment models, but it's roughly some of the same thing if you're simply lifting and shifting an application. As you go beyond that, you can start developing applications specifically for containers. Clearly that now buys you into a whole new realm of possibilities. But when you really start to take advantage of the cloud, you begin to move into that PaaS and the FAS, as it says, functions as a service. Those are where you can really take advantage of new functionalities, whether it's machine learning algorithms, whether it's storing your data. In our case, we have Cosmos DB, kind of a NoSQL as a platform that can masquerade as Cassandra or some of the Gremlin type databases, lots of different form factors. And then functions, serverless platform. That's where you can have this whole new universe of functionality built into your applications. And for the management guys up there, that's where you really start to save money, because those platforms, those serverless pieces, they'll scale elastically in and out. You don't really have to monitor them. You don't have to do too much with them. In an ideal situation, they're reacting to the amount of traffic, the amount of load that they're taking on. And in doing so, they're not sitting there like a virtual machine is running for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, when there's nothing really happening on there. You guys good with all that? I wanted to say, make sure I'm here to interact. So if you have questions, comments, please chime in. This is kind of taken from a hodgepodge of different slides. I'm trying to just, again, lay that framework for where DevOps starts to layer in. In this case, not really related to DevOps, but these are some of those modern concepts that you can focus on. Containers, clearly Docker, Kubernetes is one of those technologies that's really taken off these days. At the end of the day, I really consider containers as a DevOps scenario. You can build up these images, containers, however you like, but then that's the DevOps can take those and run with it. They can deploy one container up to a website and just host it in a single instance, or it can take it down to something like Kubernetes and smatter it all over, a whole cluster full of containers. Microservices is another concept. Some people will intermingle some of the container technologies with microservices concepts, but microservices really is just a concept. You're going to take large monolithic applications and break it down into lots of small parts. And those small parts can then evolve independently of each other. So instead of trying to deploy one giant application every 3 weeks or every 3 months, you can deploy your little moving parts as you need to. Serverless, same kind of thing. Functions, if you're familiar with Amazon Web Services or anything like that, those are just little, ideally smaller snippets of code that you can simply upload natively or package and compile. But idea is they're small pieces that all work together. Here's a cheesy little slide that shows a monolithic application. Point being, that's, say 3 virtual machines there, and you have the blue, orange, and green dots that are all representing, a piece of that application. but that whole thing is deployed on 3 different virtual machines. As opposed to a microservices application where you have a bunch of little pieces, and then as you spread those out over lots of different servers, you'll kind of notice that the purple ones aren't always with the orange ones. The green ones aren't always with the brown ones. You know, you're taking a cluster of machines and you're combining all of that compute power into just a layer where you can spread out your containers and build scalable platforms or scalable applications that way. Okay, so the whole point of that was to talk about, okay, well, if we want to grow into modern applications and we want to take on some of that philosophy, how do we get there? You know, in my opinion, there's this huge intertwining between DevOps and application modernization. So in that scenario, what does DevOps mean? It means, this is Microsoft's official motto or tagline on it, the union of people, processes, and tools to enable continuous delivery of value to our customers. I have a better definition that I personally like better, which is the idea of getting code that you guys as developers write into production as fast as possible. So all of us that write code, you know, if you're like me and you're old, you know, you used to write code and it would show up 3 months later, and you know, there's really no joy in that. These days, you know, in some of these shops that are ultra sophisticated, they're deploying several times a day, hundreds of times a day. You know, essentially every check-in that passes through those gates gets deployed out the door that day. There's something to be said about that as a developer, and the sense of accomplishment and all that kind of stuff that you can feel that way. But the overarching point is that you are affecting your application as quick as you can. No need to keep a bug sitting out there for 3 months while you're trying to work on features. So I'm trying not to make this too sales pitchy. Obviously, Visual Studio VSTS in this case is our Microsoft's DevOps platform. You know, we have built this application ourselves in-house over the last 4 years to support our internal teams. So when our new CEO came aboard about 4 years ago, one of his first decrees was, you know, I've got a department over here that's deploying with Jenkins, and I've got a department over here that's using TFS. We're going to put that all together. So right from the beginning of that change in leadership, a lot of stuff changed behind the scenes. And there were many thousands of developers that all came together to start moving in that direction. The eventual result, which is what you can, you know, now use off the shelf, if you will, is VSTS. Obviously, TFS, if you're using the on-premise version, is very similar. A little bit different cycle for rolling out changes into that product. VSTS is one of those software applications that gets updated a couple hundred times a day.
Can we just poll the audience to see who's using VSTS?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. How many, you guys use TFS or VSTS?
You have to ask it separately.
Well, either one. Do you guys use any of those? Okay, VSTS, keep your hands up. Couple. And TFS? You guys, all you TFS guys people know that about VSTS and where that kind of slots into the ecosystem? Good?
So our ALM specialist who handles this is Dave Ruckert right here in the front row. So if you have any questions about VSTS, if you want to move your project, that is an option through ALM. So talk to Dave about that if you're interested.
What's the benefit?
So, you know, that was weird. Essentially the benefit, let me know if that went off. I wonder if the Teams thing died. Obviously, from a it's kind of the same story as like Office and Office 365. VSTS becomes our hosted version of that we host and run on Azure in the cloud. Bear with me. Good.
Yeah, we're good. Yep.
All right, so VSTS is our version that's hosted running in the cloud. Some of the benefits are you don't have to patch that yourself. You don't have to upgrade that yourself. That site gets updated more or less every 3 weeks, although they actually deploy regularly, daily, small changes. The different pricing model, different access model, VSTS is hosted, so you do most of it through the browser, either through the browser or you can integrate through Visual Studio. How many people use Visual Studio? How many people don't use Visual Studio? Couple. It's all right. Does that answer the question a little bit? All right. So what is VSTS or TFS? Well, it's Microsoft's answer to DevOps. The kind of the 4 components there, and you can kind of think of it from your development process and what you do on a daily basis. Code repository, so equate that to GitHub or some of the other products that are on site. You can take your code from Visual Studio or any other project, and using Git or command line, you can check that in and push it up to your repositories. Nothing groundbreaking there. Our pricing model is a little bit different. Namely, all that's pretty much free, so that's a good thing. But then as you check things in, kind of the traditional or the newer DevOps processes, as people check in code, that may go through some sort of pull request where somebody is actually going to do a code review on that and decide yes or no, I'm going to let that into the branch. Or you can simply push it up into the branch and then your changes get merged in, whether you're on the master branch or a feature branch or just your own kind of development branch. That's a whole separate discussion, but point is you check your code in, right? Well, with kind of our process in VSTS, usually that check-in process will kick off a build process. So, build process can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For kind of a traditional .NET project, that's taking something like MS Build and compiling your code into DLLs or executables and getting it somewhere. So that's build, right? And then release is not really on here, but part of the build and test. Release, you then take those artifacts that you've built and you want to put them somewhere. Again, that could be in a simple process. It could be push it out to production. More likely it's, hey, we want to get that into some sort of dev test environment. And then from there, we want to gate it out, meaning that somebody's going to have to approve it to go from dev test out to staging. And then you may have user acceptance testing or those types of things that happen on that environment. And then as somebody else gates that through the process, you're going to deploy that out to production. So in a perfect world, that's all very smooth. In reality, Visual Studio or VSTS is built to allow you to manage that process however you want. So a lot of times there's a lot of personal interaction with that process. You have some sort of dev manager or QA manager that's going to pull the trigger on that and actually let that roll forward. The takeaway with that is that there's this nice pipelining tool. I'll show you some of that when I get going on the demo. That allows you to build these pipelines, whether as simple or as complex as you want them, to be able to facilitate all of that application movement. Here we go again. All right, so how does DevOps work? Nothing earth-shattering on this thing. Combination of security, operations, capabilities, quality. The point I want to show you on this slide is, as I mentioned, this is now Microsoft using our own tools to build VSTS. And this blue chart that runs across that bottom right kind of shows you that in 2012, we're talking about 22 kind of features that got rolled out, 58, 65, 111. And then as you can see, as this really kicked into gear, all of a sudden that jumped up to 262. 2017, way more than that. We were at 250, and this slide's a little bit old, so I think we finished out the year over 300. That's meant to just give you some indication that as your DevOps pipelines and your operations mature, you can really turn that into some tangible benefits to the company. I don't know. This is a kind of a salesy slide here. Our offering there, Visual Studio Team Services, Visual Studio, obviously, if you're using that as your development platform, those go really nice together. And then Azure. Obviously, as Craig, the sales guy, wants you to do everything we want up in Azure. But we know that that's not always the case, whether it's AWS or on-premise or whatever the case is. VSTS, from a DevOps point of view, doesn't care. It can deploy out to pretty much anywhere that you want to deploy out if you can just install the right agents in the right places. Any questions? Good to go? All right, here's my fancy slide with lots of logos here. Again, plan and track, I just glossed over it. If you're a project manager or you oversee developers, there's the entire part of the thing that I skipped over, which is project planning. So sprints, user stories, bugs, epics, if you get into that kind of thing. All that is kind of in that right branch that allows you to manage your workflow. Sorry, I got to keep moving this thing. I'm just going to zip through here. Another big piece that we haven't even talked about, monitor and learn. So as you deploy things out, we've got this huge thing these days where everything is spitting off data, whether that's logs, telemetry, usage, user usage, that kind of thing. We want to be able to collect all that and analyze that kind of data. So we don't want to forget about that part. VSTS has a story about that, but I'm not going to get too much into that today unless somebody really wants to talk about that. Again, to the point, VSTS is open to all these things. All of these have plugins or can deploy to these different tools. The point is we want to meet our developers where they're at. So we try not to force Microsoft down your throat like in previous years. I'm sure you guys are aware of that, but Microsoft has clearly become a different beast over the last 4 or 5 years. Thought I had a couple more slides, bear with me. All right, well, let's get into some demos. All right, these are definitely not like high polished sales demos. I want to walk you through some of this stuff, show you multiple different ways that you can accomplish things. Really the idea here is just to spark some thinking. How could I take this project I'm working on and maybe add a little bit to it or overhaul it into these new scenarios. How many people have exposure to Azure? Good, a lot. So this is, sorry. Try this. All right.
Okay, we're good.
Good. All right. Okay, Azure portal, right? So if you're a developer or anything like that, hopefully you've seen some of this stuff. This is your lifeline to Azure. So building websites, managing virtual machines, setting up virtual networks, any kind of Kubernetes cluster, anything like that. This is where you can start. The thing I want to point out today is that we've got this new button in here. If you've used your portal lately, you probably see this portal. We kind of just plop it in there. But the whole idea is we've got this new concept called a DevOps Project. It's something that spans VSTS, it spans Azure. It kind of just tries to glue a lot of those pieces together for you so that you have this rounded out scenario for getting projects out of Visual Studio into Azure through Visual Studio Team Services. The beauty of this is that I can just click this button here and I get all sorts of choices. In this scenario, we're probably talking about a user that doesn't have an existing project. They're just, this is a good way to get into the VSTS realm and see how it works. What I can do here is I can just kind of bootstrap a project from scratch. Project, in this case, meaning the code that goes with it, the Azure components that I want to deploy to, and a VSTS project that I want to use to manage the team and the project. Just to kind of prove an earlier point, I'll pick Java here. Who knew Java would run in Azure, right? Spring application, nothing sophisticated here. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and pick web app for containers, meaning that we're going to take our Java app, we're going to package it up as a Docker container, and then we're going to ship it out that way. Everyone cool with that? All right. This is where you plug in all your existing stuff. I always kind of name my stuff the same. You pick your Azure subscription, you name it, and you pick a location. Let's go West US, right? I just click done. Right there, it goes to work. We could probably, I'm going to do the cooking show thing, right? Could probably sit here and wait for this thing to go, but I'm going to show you what the end result is. So you can see it's a couple weeks old. But when I click on what would be the equivalent resource that we just created here, this is what you're going to see. You got some CICD pipeline. Everybody familiar with that terminology? Anybody not familiar with CICD? All right, CICD, continuous integration, continuous delivery. Simple concept is the CI part is I'm a developer and I want to just check my stuff in continuously, right? I want to continuously integrate my changes into the code repository. Continuous delivery, just like it sounds, we want to continuously deliver those changes out to our deployment, our environments, whether that's dev, test, production, something else. All right, so CI/CD pipeline, which, we kind of take a little bit of an opinionated thing where we really try and focus on separating the build from the release pipeline. So build, obviously, I want to take my project, get it up into VSTS, have it build and create an artifact or several artifacts. Those artifacts then can be used by a release pipeline to distribute them out to various environments. So rarely does the end result of all this look like a nice simple pipeline where, hey, I check in my code and it ends up in production. There's usually lots of those baby steps in between. My repository. So if I click on that repository button, I end up in VSTS, which is under the guise of visualstudio.com URL. And I can see all of my code in here. And if I expand that, you'll see that indeed it is a Java application. Just really not doing much, just redirecting you to an index page, right? And so Sorry, I don't want to mess up the sharing again. If I run that, this is the application as it exists right now out in the world. Just show you that it is there and running. Sorry, jumping around a little bit. When I go back to my dashboard here, show you my resource group. You guys familiar with resource groups? In Azure, simple concept. It's just a wrapper for a bunch of stuff that I want to cram together and hold in one kind of container. Shouldn't use the word container these days, but portfolio, if you will. So in that resource group, I've got a couple things like application insights. We'll come back and touch on that. But the main thing I've got here is my app service, which is simply, I think back to the good old days of web hosting, right? So this is essentially a web server that's hosting my application. Sorry. Want to show you that in a nutshell, this website is running a Docker container. So as we look real quick into the system that builds this, you'll see that artifact that we talked at the end of the build pipeline is an actual Docker container. So I just wanted to prove that point there. All right, so let's take a look at this project. And again, this is kind of the project that we spun up in VSTS when we clicked that button back in Azure. And we've got all of our code. We kind of looked at that already. Then we've got this build and release segment. In this case, I've got a build definition, just one. I could have many if I wanted to. And I want to edit that just to show you what that looks like. In this case, not very sophisticated. So I simply take my code, get it up there, build an image. Go away. There we go. I simply build an image, and then I'm going to push that image into an Azure Container Registry. So in Azure, we have this concept, just like Docker Hub, if you're familiar with that. It's a place I can push up all of my images, my container images, and have them sit there. The distinction between Docker Hub is those are all public, kind of the GitHub concept. In Azure Containers or Azure Container Registry, I can save all that securely in my own account. Nobody else can get to it. Am I making sense there? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come back to my code. And I kind of want to get this kicked off so it'll have time to go. I just want to point out, okay, this says success with Java, right? I'm just going to change that in my source code, success with Java in Azure. I'm going to save that. This is stored in Git on VSTS. So can you guys see that all right? Basically just checking it in. All right, and then I'm going to push this code change up into Visual Studio, VSTS, sorry. Oh. I want to point out that all of that magically kicks off this build pipeline. So that's probably not earth-shattering for anybody here, but you know, I can do things like I could do that manually if I wanted to. In this case, for the sake of the demo, I got that automated. Over here shows me my history. I can, you know, you can kind of see this little gray bar over here starts inching up. And if I click on this, this is this particular build. I got my logger that I can look at and see, okay, now it's building my image. This will take a few minutes. I mean, we don't need to sit here and watch this all day. But the point is, I've checked in my code. It's being pulled out by the CICD and the build pipeline, which gets triggered. And now it's taking all that code, that Java code that I built, it's sending it over to a build agent. In this case, the build agent is a shared hosted Azure build agent, meaning that, you know, I don't have to set it up. I don't have to manage virtual machines, anything like that. It kind of glues it all together for me. And as it gets that code, it runs in Maven, compiles all the Java and spits out the necessary artifacts, which are then going to get put into our image. All right. So let me so our image is going to end up getting or residing in our Azure Container Registry. That makes sense. And sorry, let me get back to it.
So some people may have stopped listening when you said the word Java, but all that would apply to a .NET application, a .NET Core application.
Absolutely.
So, okay.
Yeah, you know, obviously you guys are .NET folks. I'll show you another project I got that does the exact same thing. Point is that we don't really care what that application is built in. You know, we've got components for Go and Java and all those varieties. So, but obviously .NET works perfect.
Can I ask a question while you're waiting?
Please.
What do you recommend, or is there a product in the DevOps suite for Microsoft that handles the challenge of pseudonymization or anonymization of data for different lanes?
For different, say that again.
Dev, test, production. How do you anonymize data for those different lanes within the DevOps?
Like test data and, you know, we definitely have some stuff in the data stack that's meant to do, I wouldn't call it anonymize, but it would obscure or obfuscate that data. You know, it'll hide it. That's clearly not what you're shooting for there. I'd have to get back to you, honestly. Nothing that I know of in our VSTS platform itself that would do something like that. But that doesn't mean it's not there in some sort of partner plugin or just something I don't know about.
Yeah, even if it's partner plugin, I'd love to hear.
I think you can build a lot of it into your build scripts too.
Yeah,
So as you
and
run in a build script, you can, if there's certain data points that you need to that you need to obscure or change, you know, a test to a stage prefix or a stage to a prod prefix, that can all be done through script.
yeah, absolutely. And VST or the build pipelines are built for PowerShell, right? I mean, anything you can do in PowerShell. Let me just show you what some of those things look like. I can click to add a new kind of thing in there. I've got lots of things I can do there. Batch scripts, build machine images, chef, copy files, delete files, Kubernetes. What I wanted to show you, PowerShell, right? Lots of different PowerShell stuff. The bottom line is anything you can put into PowerShell will slot right into here because you're just dumping a script into a build step. So that could definitely be a decent solution there. I wanted to, being a Microsoft shop, you guys probably don't. So one of the things that if you're into virtual machines, or even if part of your pipelines are building up Azure resources, for a good example is if you want to materialize a virtual machine or a app service website out of thin air, you can add those into your process to say, okay, here's an ARM template. You guys know what ARM templates are? That's a code or infrastructure as code, JSON or XML, just a big chunk of code that you can take and say, hey, Azure, give me this. And you pass in that big chunk and it'll spin up virtual machines or websites or whatever you want to put in there. So when you take that scenario into a build pipeline, you can build and materialize an entire production environment, but an entire environment, deploy all your stuff across there, run acceptance or Selenium tests or something like that against that, check the results, and then tear that all back down. And the beauty of that is that you can, assume that you're starting from nothing. So as your DevOps pipeline materializes, you can take that same idea into production. When you start thinking about swapping between productions or API versions or anything like that, you can do some cool stuff when you can just completely build an entire deployment from thin air, right? Back to our build. You'll see now I got a green bar over there, success. So we've built our container, and I want to show you where that landed inside of our I've got two of these here, so I never remember which one's which. Container registry, right? Then my repositories, just a folder more or less. And I don't have a real good way of showing you or proving it, but build 30 right here is kind of my version number for my container that I just spit out. So now that the build has succeeded, we can kind of look at the release and see that 6 minutes ago, our release executed. So now I've got my build pipeline funneling into my release pipeline and spit that out. So in theory, you guys tracking with me? So in theory, that should change now. So, very, not that exciting. Thank you, though. Yeah, that's right. The whole point is that if I'm a developer and I'm in a modern DevOps platform, I've now just checked in my code and I can see it running live in 10, 15 minutes. So. Hey, Jim, how long do we have? Am I going to go over?
Go till 2.
All right. I mean, that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to show you. I probably spent way too much time on slides. Next time I promise I won't bring any slides and make up for it. Yeah, that's good. You guys have anything you want to see, questions, comments? Please, fire away.
Maybe somebody, so I put together a build process and I wrote this little PowerShell script. And I've noticed as it's building those PowerShell scripts, it kind of wraps it up into a PowerShell script and runs it. So I never actually see what's going on inside there. Is there any way of kind of getting more information as that's processing?
I've not heard that before. I'm not big on PowerShell personally, so I don't put much of it into my, mine are usually pretty simple compared to what your real life scenarios are going to be. So you shoot me an email if you want, and I'll check on it. And something doesn't sound right there, right? Hopefully there's a way that the whole point of spitting all those logs out, right, is that shows you what you're doing wrong and where the errors are. So definitely reach out and so Dave, who some of you may have known that came before me, he actually moved to the VSTS team. So he's kind of my inlet into all the behind the scenes working there. So anything like that, I can surface up to him.
Okay.
Good? All right.
Thanks.
Yeah.